Hello, class. Today I'll be talking about the doctrine of creation and understanding creation, how we understand it both as a religious teaching and as a reality that envelops us. The doctrine of creation is the beginning of Christian theology, no pun intended. It is the theological answer to the question, where does everything come from and why is it here? Belief in creation, that we live in a created order which is rational, able to be understood, and governed by a higher power, is a belief that goes back to the beginning of human civilization and has existed in most cultures. Only in the past few centuries, in fact, have humans attempted what we might call an atheistic explanation of the universe. Something like, and this is how the story often goes, that it comes from nothing and is essentially nothing more than matter and energy crashing into each other, giving rise eventually to life, and finally to intelligent life, which is capable of knowing or reflecting on the universe itself. And there's nothing more to say. In the ancient and medieval world, and in many pockets of the modern world, that reflection on the universe itself has been an act of contemplation and praise. And that is where the doctrine of creation really comes from. It is human beings reflecting on this awesome mystery that we call the universe or the world, etc. It is another way of saying that the universe we are part of is awesome in the fullest sense of that word. And the fact that I exist as a living, breathing creature capable of thought, emotions, relationships, love, disappointments and challenges, even the negative emotions and really awful things that are part of life. Everything that life brings with it, all of it, is worthy of contemplation and praise. Beyond that, most cultures have had a creation narrative, a story to explain, or at least make sense out of human existence as part of a greater whole, where we come from and what it's all about. Now, these creation narratives actually exist in many styles and forms, and you can read some of them, and they're very, very fascinating. They say a lot about who the people are and what they're about and where they kind of see everything going. One, for example, says that humans were born from, and creatures' life was born from a cosmic egg. There are other stories tell about conflicts between gods or divine beings that gave rise to planet Earth and her creatures, and so forth. There are creation narratives as diverse as there are peoples and cultures on Earth. The creation narrative from Genesis, there are actually two, one in Genesis chapter 1 and another in chapter 2, probably by different authors, as biblical scholars believe. But the narrative from Genesis, and both of them fall into this category, with one notable exception. There is one God in charge, calling the universe into existence, ordering it in a certain way, governing it, if you like, and living also in an intimate relationship with it, as the second creation narrative from Genesis 2 tends to emphasize God sort of creating by getting his fingernails dirty in the dirt of the earth. All theology, not least in the Judeo-Christian tradition, refers back to God as creator. This has been de-emphasized in more recent theology for a variety of reasons, but there have been theologians, the liberal theological camp, for example, as Zola defines, wants to emphasize the importance of human ingenuity, science, technology, and so forth. In a sense, to liberate human beings from what they saw as a backward understanding of a divine creator. This is oversimplifying a bit, but as an attempt to liberate theology from what they would have said are primitive beliefs. But faith and theology, as well as their sources, cannot escape belief in a creator. So what is the significance? Why does it matter? Well, to believe in a creator and in a divine origin for the natural world automatically confers to it some level of sacrality. You cannot look at the world as God's creation and at the same time see raw material to be mined, shipped, exploded, polluted, and so forth. If God is holy, then the created order is on some level holy and must be treated with some reverence. Now, I have to say with that immediately that another quirk of our theological tradition is as I said, a belief in one God and a view that God is largely separate from creation, sort of different from some other faith traditions. This comes in part also from Greek philosophy. And it has been argued that Western science, the Enlightenment and its method of understanding the universe, together with Christian theology, is precisely the thing that has allowed what some have called an assault on the created order, such as Passionist priest Thomas Berry. So for a couple of reasons, the Judeo-Christian tradition, and Christianity in particular, has been a culprit, at least indirectly, for our current ecological disaster. To put it simply, we have too many people on a finite planet using natural resources at an unsustainable rate. It has led to horrid maldistribution of resources, poverty, and migration, as we are now seeing, for example, through Latin America toward North America, wars over oil, and a warming planet supercharged by the human burning of fossil fuels. The climate catastrophe that we are currently living through is due in large part to human irresponsibility, which I would argue stems in large part from a view of creation as raw material to do with as we please. And one of the complaints, rightly so, in the movement of ecological theology is the anthropocentrism, the human-centered attitude and view toward the universe that many in the Western world have. There are two primary approaches to creation in Christian theology that I want to comment on, so you kind of understand where we come from, what the background is. That is, how we understand God's creative activity. The first is creatio ex nihilo. That's the Latin that means creation out of nothing. This view comes in part from the Bible, Genesis 1 especially, and also from theologians in the early and medieval church, and contemporary theologians as well, such as St. Augustine of Hippo, an African bishop. The Greek view of creation from Plato's Timaeus was that there was a demiurge, he called it, that brought everything into existence, much the way a potter or an artist creates or forms their art. In the Timaeus, Plato says that there are four fundamental substances. Does that sound familiar? Water, air, earth, and fire. And that humans are kind of a composite of the physical substrate, body, and mind, or nous. Plato even believed that we stood upright because our minds are in our heads somehow. They didn't really understand brain science, but knew enough that something up there was important, like if we got injured, for example. And our minds have reason, and they're drawn towards the heavens, which in ancient cosmology was basically considered divine. Stars and the sun, the moon, etc. They ordered our lives and were kind of considered, in some cases, divine beings themselves. There was so much mystery to what we now call outer space, a place humans could never possibly go, but we could contemplate and reflect on. And in our contemporary modern world, having a lost connection to the non-human natural world has changed all of that quite a bit. The problem with Plato's view of creation, a divine artificer, was the issue of time, how time was conceived, and what role it played in creation. St. Augustine reflects on this toward the end of the Confessions, the mystery of time itself, and what it means to live in the past, present, and future. What he came to see was that the Platonic view of creation, the one we probably think of most in our heads, kind of doesn't work, because it assumes God is creating the world as a moment in time. But if God is the source of everything, then God must have also created time itself. That's how the logic goes. And so Augustine developed a doctrine of creation cum tempore, creation with time, as opposed to creation in time, as one event in an ongoing string of events. That is to say, God is the source of all events, experience, the universe, and therefore everything is dependent on God. The philosophical word for this is contingency. The great theologian philosopher of the Middle Ages, Thomas Aquinas, argued for the contingency of all being. Everything that is contingent. It exists, but it could just as well not exist. Now, this may sound strange and even a little scary when you first hear and understand it, but it also gives you a sense for the awesome wonder of creation, its giftedness, if you will, and the miracle that we get to be a part of it. Augustine calls the universe the original miracle, and he has what might be called an omni-miraculous view of creation. When we talk about miracles, sometimes it's easy to get caught up in debates about Jesus' works and wonders, whether they truly broke the law of physics, etc. But we can easily lose sight of the real miracle, which is that there is anything at all, and that you and I are alive and get to be part of it. So, that's something to keep in mind. Creatio ex nihilo is about creation out of nothing, not just creation at the beginning of time, although it's also that. It is a way of emphasizing the radical transcendence of God, our dependence on God, so to speak, and the contingency of all being, as I said. Schleiermacher, as we've talked about a little in class, said that faith is the feeling of absolute dependence, a very important phrase for him. Faith is rooted in feeling and intuition, as mentioned, and the quality of that feeling reflects the fullness of the Christian theological tradition. So, the other major theological tradition or view about creation in Christian theology is creatio continua. That's Latin for continual creation. And this is the view that God is still active in creating anew, even within the course of human and natural history. This has also existed pretty much throughout Christian history. The denial of this is essentially deism, which teaches that God was present at the beginning, setting the universe in motion, but otherwise absent from the course of history, and present really only in universal divine laws that we experience, such as the laws of physics. Alternatively, to affirm creatio continua is to say that God is present, acting in history and in our lives, and that God can bring about good even out of evil, such as Romans 8:28. It can also mean that God is active in the universe, bringing new forms out of old ones, new ideas and creativity into being, and bringing hope out of despair. This conviction is at the heart of the Moltmann reading for this week, that creation is an open system, oriented towards the future, and that God works in history by opening up closed systems. Creation is always also new creation, at least for Moltmann, and the quote, the completion of the creative process in the kingdom of glory is the indwelling of God in the new creation. As he says on page 125, this reflects the biblical view of the New Jerusalem in Revelation 21, where God comes down from heaven to dwell with God's people eternally, not the other way around. We don't fly up to heaven. The Gebara reading on the Trinity, a doctrine I have not addressed directly, at least not yet, emphasizes the importance of unity in multiplicity and vice versa. That is, the Trinity for Gebara is as much about the experience of diversity and plurality in nature as it is about Aristotle's substance metaphysics, as the early and medieval church explained it. Now, it's kind of important to understand where that comes from, but there's a kind of a new way of looking at Trinitarian thinking. And such thinking stands against what she calls, quote, the idolatry of the individual, the pure race, the empire, etc., on page 168. So, both of these traditions, creatio ex nihilo and creatio continua, complement one another. The first emphasizing God's divine transcendence, and the second God's immanence, creatio continua. Both of these are important pieces of the doctrine of creation. To trust in God the Creator means to trust in the one who set everything in motion, and to trust, against all evidence to the contrary, that that same God walks alongside us in loving, vulnerable immanence. And at the same time, the doctrine of creation is about trusting in the world beyond humankind, the creation as good, as a source of beauty, challenge, and even care for us. As much as we talk about caring for creation, creation also cares for us, which is kind of hard to get your mind around sometimes. Creation is good ultimately because God is good. It is in fact God's goodness, the pouring out toward creation, that gives us life and hope and a future, and a reason to fight for the preservation of creation. On behalf of other life forms, the flora and fauna of our ecosystems that we're a part of, and the integrity of the planet itself. So that's a primer on creation. I wish you all happy reading, and I'll see you in class or online soon.